Hello, friends, and welcome back to Scattered Thoughts. This is episode number 9. My name's Timothy Zaccanino. I'm going to be your host for Scattered Thoughts today, and today we're talking about a piece of magic terminology that gets thrown around to describe cards 1,000 different ways, and how that term actually applies to magic cards. You already saw the thumbnail, you clicked the video. That's right, we're talking about the phrase strictly better, and explaining how the people who make magic cards use this term. It is a very controversial thing in the magic world because people use it 1,000 different ways, but there is a specific way that the people who are designing magic use the term strictly better, and that's how it applies to magic cards. And we're going to go ahead and straighten that out, give some examples, maybe even play a little game at the end, who knows. That's the name of the game today, but before we get into this topic, this extremely controversial, crucial topic, I do want to mention a few things about the channel. First things first, if you don't know me in real life, if you're not a personal friend of mine, you only know the YouTube channel, I am having a baby, my firstborn, in about 2 weeks from the time this video goes up, maybe even sooner than that. So I will be much more infrequent at posting videos, scattered thoughts episodes, stuff like that. Not that I'm like a big time YouTuber and I post all the time anyway, but if you're like, man, Jank Diver Gaming hasn't posted to the YouTube channel in a while, that's why I'm probably losing sleep and trying to get a new human being acclimated to the world. While I'm gone, your support would mean quite a bit, obviously. I'm not asking for financial support, but if you want to drop a like, a comment, a subscription to the YouTube channel, feel free to do that. The best way that you can support me while I'm gone is by just supporting Jank Diver Gaming. We have a Discord group, which is listed down in the description below. They do weekly drafts. You can win some gems on Arena. It's cube drafting. We've put a lot of work, almost 3 years of work into these cubes at this point, and the community has been drafting very regularly on Sundays and maybe even Wednesdays now for our Peasant Cube. Just go support Jank Diver Gaming. That will be supporting me as well. I will be probably a little more active on Twitter during my downtime, if there is any downtime in parenting. So find the links to our Jank Diver Gaming Twitter channel as well, and you can keep in touch with me there. But yeah, any sort of support is helpful. Any kind of reaching out helps a lot and lets us know that we're doing a good thing here at Jank Diver Gaming. We put a lot of work into it. So with all of that under the rug, all the housekeeping out of the way, let's talk about the term strictly better. The reason I want to talk about this pressing matter at all in the first place is because we're in the middle of infinite spoiler season. We have been for like 2 or 3 years now, and almost undoubtedly every time a card that looks even remotely like another card gets spoiled or, showcased during preview season, there's a comment that's like, wow, this is strictly better than that other card, and then somebody else will undoubtedly show up and be like, well, that's not what strictly better means in this case, blah 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 blah, so it can't be strictly better. And then there's an argument because people are thinking about the term strictly better in different ways. So we are going to spend a lot of this video kind of hammering out how magic creators use the term strictly better and how it applies to cards. I think a lot of the confusion comes from the fact that there is a clear distinction between what the English dictionary definition of strictly better would mean and the actual Magic research and development R&D team definition. Magic uses the term strictly better a little bit differently than how strictly better would read if you just looked up the words in a dictionary, and that's why people end up having arguments when it comes up in conversation, is because they're being used in 2 different ways. If we were to look at a strict dictionary definition, it would be something like this. A is strictly better than B if it's better in every conceivable situation. I mean, that's what strictly better would mean if you took it as literally as possible, right? Strictly means in every situation, and better means better. So strictly better would mean it's always better, no matter what, hands down. There's nothing that could change that. And of course, that would mean that in the real world, nothing could ever be strictly better than something else, right? Because you can always conceive of a situation where A is better than B, even though B is better than A like 95% of the time, right? I have a good example for this that's going to kind of lead into how R&D thinks about strictly better, and that's the example of a $100 bill versus a $20 bill. Now, if we just think about real-world application and we don't get too complicated with it, it's pretty clear that a $100 bill is better than a $20 bill, right? You can buy more stuff with it, it has more inherent value, it has Benjamin Franklin's face on it, right? 100 is better than a $20 bill, pretty much hands down. And it seems like it would be strictly better, but there are situations that you can conceive of where it would be better to have a $20 bill than a $100 bill, right? Imagine you're going to go buy flowers for your significant other, and you have a $100 bill in your pocket, which is supposedly strictly better than a $20 bill, and you find out that they don't accept $100 bills there. That's all you've got. They don't accept it. You don't have any other form of payment. You can't buy your item because you had a $100 bill instead of a $20 bill. Another example, you're walking home from the flower store and you're robbed at gunpoint. Oh no, and your money is stolen, right? Well, in that situation, I think it's pretty obvious that it would have been better for you to have a $20 bill in your pocket than a $100 bill because you lost more money in that situation, right? Now, if we look at those two examples and we think about the dictionary definition of strictly better, well, a $100 bill was not strictly better than a $20 bill there because we found situations where it would have been better to have a $20 bill. But this is the crux of this whole conversation here. By the magic R&D definition of strictly better, it doesn't matter that you came up with corner case scenarios. The $100 bill is still strictly better than the $20 bill, even if there are examples that you can come up with where the $20 bill is better than the 100. Strictly better does not mean better in every possible situation when you're talking about Magic the Gathering. So, with all that being said, why don't we talk about what it means to be strictly better in Magic? An MTG definition of strictly better would go something like this. Card A is strictly better than card B if, in isolation, A is better than B in at least one way, but worse in 0 ways. And I do want to emphasize that part in isolation. This is like a huge, huge thing when it comes to talking about strictly better in Magic the Gathering. We look at cards in vacuums. R&D looks at cards in vacuums whenever they use this term. They don't consider a board state. They don't consider cards across different formats. They don't consider the monetary value of cards or how a card functioned in a specific limited format versus a different limited format. We're talking about cards in isolation. You're holding card A in your left hand, you're holding card B in your right hand, you are comparing them directly to each other, and there are no outside forces swaying whether or not a card is better or worse because of other cards outside of just card A and B. I should put a little asterisk here as well that creature types are not really considered in the conversation because there's nothing inherently different about creature types from a gameplay perspective. Obviously, there are things that might interact with a certain creature type, so a lot of times people will say that a merfolk is better than a crab, even though they're the exact same card because merfolk has more support. And while that's true, remember, we're looking at cards in isolation. Merfolk is no different than Crab when you're looking at a card side by side if everything else is the same. So we don't really consider creature types. Creature types are not strictly better or worse than other creature types. So that's not really going to be part of the conversation today. This whole evaluation in isolation thing is really important. There's always somebody who wants to come out of the woodworks when this conversation comes up and mention the Muraganda petroglyphs example, which if you're not familiar, that's an enchantment that says creatures with no abilities get +2/+2, right? And we always think of like a vanilla creature versus the same exact creature that has like an ETB, like same stat line, same mana value, except one of them's a vanilla and one of them does something. We always think of the ETB creature as strictly better than the creature with no ability, right? But then somebody has to pop up and be like, well, if you had Muraganda petroglyphs on the battlefield, wouldn't it be better if you had the vanilla creature? And like, yes, that's true, but in the case of strictly better, you don't consider outside influences. You wouldn't consider this third card, this enchantment that's pumping one of them, because those cards are no longer in isolation. Once you add a third card into the mix, you're no longer having a conversation about strictly better. You're simply comparing things through different metrics. Before we get into the categories that make a card strictly better or worse than another card, here's another way to think about it, and this is the way that I heard Marshall Sutcliffe from Limited Resources. He said this is the way that he kind of encapsulated the idea of strictly better, and it's just this. Card A obsoletes card B. If you have access to two cards, you're holding one in your left hand, you're holding one in your right hand, the strictly better card always takes precedence over the strictly worst one, right? And just a clear example of this is Lightning Bolt versus Shock. This is one of the most clear examples of strictly better that you can ever get. Yes, you can conceive of examples, really convoluted examples, by the way, where it would be better to have a Shock in your hand than a Lightning Bolt, but when you're simply comparing the cards side by side, it's very clear that Lightning Bolt is just a better version, a strictly better version of Shock. And if you have access to both cards and they're both legal in your format, there's no reason to play Shock when you have access to Lightning Bolt. Lightning Bolt obsoletes Shock. So if they're both legal in your format, Lightning Bolt is just better than Shock. If you're making a choice between which one to play, you play the Lightning Bolt. So that's going to go ahead and bring us to some categories. If a card is strictly better than another card, it is strictly better because it fits into one of these 6 categories that I've laid out here. And one or two of the categories might be overlapping a little bit. So this isn't like a big spelled out thing. These are just the categories that I came up with that kind of highlight how things are strictly better than other things. The first category is just, I think, the clearest way to determine that card A is strictly better than card B, and that's that they're both creatures and one of them happens to be a bigger creature at the same exact cost, right? I mean, if we look at a 5-mana 3/3 and a 5-mana 4/4 with the exact same mana cost, it's pretty clear to people that the 4/4 is better than the 3/3. And I'm going to throw the example of Venser's Sliver on board, and of course somebody has to jump out of the woods and be like, well, Slivers are more supported than Golems or whatever, creature type doesn't matter. Again, 5-mana 4/4, pretty easily better than 5-mana 3/3, although I do want to emphasize here that they have to have the same exact mana cost. Once you start tweaking the mana cost, you're having a little bit of a different conversation. So just to reiterate, as long as 2 cards have the exact same mana cost, even down to the pips required to cast it, card A is better than card B if it just has better stats. And I do want to remind you that card A has to be better in at least one way, but worse in 0 ways, so it can't have higher power and lower toughness. It has to be at least equal across the board and have at least one stat be higher than the other one in order for it to be strictly better than the card you're comparing it to. That one's pretty straightforward. People recognize that, and I think they recognize this next category as well, and that's that you're paying less mana for an equal effect. Card A is strictly better than card B if it has the exact same effect, but it's cheaper to cast. These are usually pretty easy to identify. If you're used to a certain effect and then it gets reprinted in a new set, but it's cheaper to cast, you're like, oh, well, that's better than the old card, right? Pretty obvious to tell when a card is strictly better than another card just because it's cheaper. Good example here being Blood Feud versus Clash of Titans. Basically the same exact card. There's not really a difference in their text box at all, but Clash of Titans is just a mana cheaper to cast. You see this as well with things like Village Rites versus Altar's Reap. Altar's Reap was in a lot of sets before, was it M21 released Village Rites? Maybe Village Rites came out in a different set before that, but we got Village Rites now, and it's just strictly better than Altar's Reap because it costs 1 less mana for the same exact effect. The next category is kind of like the reverse of that. So instead of keeping the effect the same and making it cheaper to cast, you do the opposite. You keep the cost the same and you make the effect better. And this is kind of the big one that contributes to power creep, which we'll talk about towards the end of this video. So keep the cost exactly the same, make the effect better. Card A is strictly better than card B if card A and card B have the same exact cost, but card A just has a better effect. Some of these can be a little bit sneaky. You've got obvious ones, of course, like Inspire and Overseer is strictly better than Priest of Ancient Lore because they're the same card, but Inspire and Overseer has flying, which is an advantage. There are some sneakier ones like Circuit Mender versus Filigree Familiar. I was a huge fan of Filigree Familiar. We played it in our Peasant Cube, but then they printed Circuit Mender, and it's just a strictly better card. It has better stats. The draw trigger triggers off of more instances of leaving the battlefield rather than just dying, and you get to maintain that gain in 2 life. Remember, you can't be worse in any way, and Circuit Mender is actually better in every conceivable way than Filigree Familiar. There aren't situations where Circuit Mender is worse unless you start adding extra effects and extra cards into the mix, which is not part of the strictly better conversation. We could go on and on with examples like this, but I think it's pretty obvious if you're looking at 2 cards and they have the same exact cost and one of them just has a better ability or has something extra tacked onto it that's an advantage, that's obviously going to be the strictly better card. The fourth category I came up with here is another pretty obvious one that we don't actually really think of that often because it usually compares cards across different colors, but if card A is easier or more flexible to cast than card B, then it's strictly better than card B. There are some pretty obvious examples. I don't know why I pulled out a bunch of bears and 2/1s for this, but if you look at a card like Field Creeper versus Curio Vendor, it's pretty obvious that the Field Creeper is the strictly better card because they're the exact same card, but Field Creeper is easier to cast. Curio Vendor has a restriction on one of the 2 mana in that it has to be blue, whereas Field Creeper does not have that restriction. And if we shift our attention over to the comparison between Vernati Shieldmate and Thraben Valiant, it's pretty clear that Vernati Shieldmate is strictly better. And in fact, as just a little bit of an aside, I thought that Vernati Shieldmate was a 2-1 when I picked this example out. So Shieldmate's actually strictly better for two reasons. A, it's higher toughness than the Thraben Valiant, and also it's just easier to cast. That green-white hybrid symbol is better than the white symbol because it gives you two options in the way that you have to cast it, whereas Thraben Valiant only gives you one option for that mana symbol. This usually applies to generic casting cost, usually on artifact creatures compared to colored cards, because a generic mana cost is just easier to fulfill. This is also part of the reason that you don't see a lot of pushed colorless creatures, because then they obsolete all of the creatures that have colored mana requirements at the same power and toughness ratio. A card like Crystalline Giant compared to just a vanilla 3-mana 3/3 has extra abilities and is easier to cast, so it just ends up being strictly better than like every vanilla 3-mana 3/3 that has a color requirement. They don't print cards like that very often because they don't just want to obsolete cards that have color requirements. You would just replace them with a colorless version of that effect if you could. The fifth category is a pretty big one. So this basically boils down to the statement instant is better than sorcery, and I think most people understand that, but being instant speed or having more opportunities of when you can cast a card makes a card strictly better, again, assuming that everything else about the card is exactly the same. If you have two effects that are identical, one of them is an instant and one of them is the sorcery, the instant is going to be strictly better because you can cast it at all the same times you could cast the sorcery. There's no restriction there, but you also have more play with it. You can cast it on an opponent's turn. You can cast it during draw phase, end step, stuff like that. Obviously, an instant version of an effect is going to be better than that same exact sorcery version at the same cost. Same goes with Flash. Flash is better than not having Flash, and that kind of goes without saying, but the reason it's strictly better is because you have more opportunities to cast that card. There is more flexibility in of when you can put that card on the stack and resolve its abilities. Look, these are just really easy to identify. If you're holding two cards in your hand and they have the same exact effect, same exact mana cost, but one's an instant and one's the sorcery, you almost always pick the instant. The only reason you wouldn't do that is if you have a deck building restriction where you need a certain mix of like instants and sorceries. But again, that's not really a strictly better conversation. That's just a deck building thing that comes up from time to time. So if you look at a card like Thrill of Possibility, this pushes out a card like Torment and Voice. It's strictly better than Torment and Voice because it does the same exact thing. The text boxes are identical, except it's an instant instead of a sorcery. And this is a way that R&D upgrades cards a lot, is by taking an effect that you know very well and just kind of turning it into an instant, or taking a creature that you're familiar with and putting Flash on it. Instant speed interaction is better than not having instant speed interaction. And I like to joke a lot that if, like, the common Magic player were designing cards, there would be no sorceries and every creature would have Flash, because every time a card gets spoiled, it feels like somebody in the comments is like, man, I wish this was an instant. Man, I wish this card had Flash. Like, they never want to do anything at sorcery speed. But this is an obvious category. Instants are better than sorceries. Everybody knows it. Nobody's arguing, and it's very easy to identify when that's the case. And the final category here is another one that's kind of similar to what we've already talked about here. I'm calling this category having more options, having more flexibility, but it's very similar to just having a stronger effect. So if we're looking at cards with the same mana cost, if one of them gives you more options, if card A gives you more options than card B, without taking away any options, without losing anything, then obviously card A is going to be strictly better than card B. A very recent example of this is a card, Obliterating Bolt. This is 1 in a red for a sorcery. It deals 4 damage to a creature or planeswalker, and if that thing dies that turn, it exiles it. Well, this is obviously strictly better than Lava Coil, and actually strictly better than Thunder and Rebuke as well. It's kind of funny, as a cube creator, me and Chris often went back and forth over whether we wanted Lava Coil or Thunder and Rebuke in our cube, because one of them exiles and one of them hits Planeswalker, so those two cards are not strictly better or worse than one another. But then Obliterating Bolt came out of nowhere and gave us the best of both worlds, right? It exiles and it hits Planeswalker, so it's just strictly better than Lava Coil and strictly better than Thunder and Rebuke, and takes the things that are better about both of them, combines it into one card. Another example of having more flexibility is just looking at triomes versus regular trilands, like the Khans of Tarkir or Shards of Alara trilands, right? Triomes and trilands do the same exact thing, but triomes have added flexibility of being able to be cycled from your hand, so they are strictly better than trilands. They both have the downside of coming in tapped, so there's nothing really different about playing them as lands, but you get some added flexibility of having the triome in your hand. We see strictly better versions of Quench all the time. Quench is a counter spell that counters something for 1 and a blue unless your opponent pays 2 mana. There's cards like Lose Focus, I believe is the name of the card, which has Replicate. It does the Quench thing as a baseline, but you can pay extra mana to basically tack on extra copies of the spell. There's also Make Disappear is a recent example from Streets of New Capenna where you can casualty it to get a copy. Those things are not things you have to do, and they change the amount of mana or resources that you're putting into a card, but they are added options on top of the baseline Quench and make them just strictly better than Quench. They are Quench, but they have added options, extra flexibility. An example that I love to use here is Pyrotechnics and Volcanic Dragon versus the Amethyst Dragon from Battle for Baldur's Gate. Pyrotechnics is a sorcery for 4 and a red, I believe, that deals 4 damage divided as you choose between anything. And then there's Volcanic Dragon, which is 4 red for a 4/4 with flying and haste. And then you have this Baldur's Gate Amethyst Dragon, which is literally just both cards tacked onto a single card, right? It has Pyrotechnics as an adventure, and then it has Volcanic Dragon as the creature half, and the costs line up exactly the same as those individual cards, right? So taking those two effects and sticking them onto a single card makes that card strictly better than either of those individual effects, because when you're holding it in your hand, you have access to more options. It's better than a Volcanic Dragon when you had Amethyst Dragon in your hand because you can cast it as a Pyrotechnics instead, and it's strictly better than a Pyrotechnics because if Pyrotechnics isn't good, you can cast it as a Volcanic Dragon instead. That's just a amusing example of how a single card can combine 2 other cards together into one and be strictly better than both of those individual cards. Here's one that might throw people off a little bit if you're not really catching on to what we're talking about with the R&D definition here, but look at Time Warp versus Temporal Manipulation. Now, I bet if you went up to a lot of enfranchised Magic players and you asked which of these is better than the other one, I think a lot of people would actually say Temporal Manipulation is better because it doesn't target. They both have effects of taking an extra turn for 3 blue. The only difference is that Time Warp targets and Temporal Manipulation does not, which leaves Time Warp open for people deflecting it or misdirectioning it or changing the target of the ability to them instead of you, so they basically get to steal your Time Warp, which is not a thing they can do with Temporal Manipulation. But based on the R&D definition, Time Warp is strictly better than Temporal Manipulation because it gives you more options. There are not very many games where you're incentivized to Time Warp somebody else, but it is an added option that you do not have with Temporal Manipulation and has the baseline same effect when you just do it on yourself, right? So this is an example where I would say card A, Time Warp, is strictly better than card B, Temporal Manipulation, but it's not just better, right? There are plenty of examples where it's better to have a Temporal Manipulation, but if you're using the R&D definition and you're sticking to it because that's how it's been defined, yes, Time Warp is strictly better than Temporal Manipulation. So let's transition here. We're going to play a quick game real quick. I'm going to go ahead and put 2 cards on the screen at a time, and in each of these examples, the term strictly better does not apply, and I want you to think about why strictly better versus strictly worse does not apply to these 2 cards. Remember, evaluate these cards in a vacuum. If you have to consider a third card to make your judgment, then you're doing something wrong here. There should be no third cards in consideration. Just look at the 2 cards side by side, think about how one might be better than the other, but the other one might be better in a different way than the first one, and then pause the video, think about why neither of them are strictly better, and then we'll talk about them. So our first example here is Vorstclaw versus Colossal Dreadmaw. I want you to look at these 2 cards, and then I want you to pause the video, think about why neither of these cards is strictly better than the other one, and then we will start the video back up and talk about it. Good? Got it? All right. Well, obviously, Vorstclaw is bigger than Colossal Dreadmaw. 7/7 is better than 6/6, and we said that having better stats at the same mana cost makes you strictly better, but you can't be worse in any way, and Colossal Dreadmaw does have Trample, which is better than not having Trample. So Vorstclaw is better on stat line. Colossal Dreadmaw is better with Trample. and neither of these cards is strictly better than the other because each one is worse in at least one way than the other one, and in order to be strictly better, you have to be worse in 0 ways. You can't be missing anything that the other one would consider an advantage. Here's another example for you. We're throwing up Cloudkin Seer and Inspiring Overseer. Take a minute to think about why neither of these are strictly better or worse than the other ones. This one's pretty obvious. I'll give you 5 seconds, and then we'll come back and talk about it. Got it? That was about 5 seconds, right? All right, Cloudkin Seer, Inspire and Overseer. Obviously, if you compare the effects, the Inspire and Overseer is better because it gains a life on top of Cantrip and on ETB. They have the same stat line, but their mana costs are different. Neither is easier to cast, neither is harder to cast, but we cannot compare 2 cards with different mana costs. They have to have the same mana cost, or one has to be better because it has a cheaper mana cost. Let's look at a Lair versus a Triumph. We'll put them up on the screen here. Take about 5 seconds to think about why neither one is strictly better than the other. And, well, Lairs come in untapped. They have a disadvantage when they come into play, but they do come in untapped, whereas Triumphs come in tapped, so that's a disadvantage for the Triumph. However, the Triumphs have Cycling, and the Lairs do not have Cycling, so that's a disadvantage for the Lairs. If there's a disadvantage on both sides that the other one could call an advantage, then they're not strictly better or worse than one another. All right, I've got 2 more examples for you here, and then a few that I'm not actually sure about that I want your help with. Let's go ahead and throw some vanillas up on the screen here. We've got Nessian Courser, Harrier Naga, and Murasa Brute. Take just a couple seconds to think about whether or not any of these cards are strictly better than the others and why that may or may not be. All right, you got it? Well, obviously these cards are all exactly the same. The only difference here are the creature types and the formats they appeared in, but those are not things that we take into consideration when we're talking about strictly better. You could make an argument that 1 or 2 of these cards was better in their individual limited format, and I might agree with you, but that would not make them strictly better. Just as a side-by-side comparison, these cards are basically all functional reprints of each other and exactly the same. None of them are strictly better, even if Ness and Courser in Theros, maybe Centaurs mattered there, Devotion to Green was important, or Murasa Brute was a warrior type, which mattered for the party mechanic in Zendikar Ryzen. None of these things matter when you're talking about strictly better, so these cards are all functionally the same. And that leads us to one final example for the guessing game here. This one's actually kind of interesting. I'm going to throw 2 cards up on the screen, Cultivate and Kodama's Reach, 2 cards that commonly get played together. Why is it that neither of these cards are strictly better or worse than the other one? Got your answer? All right. Well, these cards are exactly the same, right? Kodama's Reach does have additional text. It is an arcane spell, which makes it look like it's strictly better than Cultivate until you realize that we can't add a third card into the mix. We can't compare these cards assuming that Arcane matters in any way, shape, or form. Because Arcane by itself doesn't do anything. It only works in combination with other spells, and since Strictly Better does not consider other spells in the conversation, Arcane basically doesn't mean anything, and these cards have exactly equivalent effects at the same mana cost. So Cultivate is not strictly worse than Kodama's Reach. I've probably said that in my life. Oh, Kodama's Reach is strictly better than Cultivate because it's Arcane. It might make your deck better, but as a side-by-side comparison, neither of these cards are strictly better. I did have 2 examples that I put on the list, and I wasn't actually sure how to classify it. So I'm going to go ahead and share these with you, and I would like for you to let me know in the comments below what you think about these. So let's take the example of Mana War versus Exclusion Mage. So Mana War is 2 and a blue for a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you return target creature to its owner's hand. Exclusion Mage has the same exact mana cost. The only difference is that when it enters the battlefield, you return a creature your opponent controls to the owner's hand. So obviously the difference here is that Mana War can bounce anything, but it can't be played on an empty board without bouncing itself, which is considered a downside. Exclusion Mage doesn't have that downside, but can't bounce your own creatures, which is an advantage that Mana War has. So what do you think here? My line of reasoning originally is that neither of these cards were strictly better or worse than the other one because Exclusion Mage not having to bounce itself on an empty board is an advantage, but Mana War being able to bounce your own creatures when you want to is also an advantage, so they each had kind of an advantage that the other one was lacking, which would make them not strictly better. But the Mana War example assumes the board state, right? It assumes that there either are or are not other creatures on your side of the board, and we don't consider board states when it comes to talking about strictly better. So if we're not considering how many other creatures we have, is Mana War just better than Exclusion Mage? I have no idea how to classify this. I thought it was an interesting example. So let me know what you think. Is Mana War strictly better or worse than Exclusion Mage if we don't consider what the board state looks like when we cast Mana War? The last example I wanted to give is one that's pretty clear now which one's better, but back in the day it wasn't, right? I'm talking about Counterspell versus Mana Drain. Now, obviously, in today's world of Magic where Mana Burn doesn't exist, Mana Drain is just a strictly better counterspell. It does the exact same thing, but it also gives you like 15 mana for no reason as well. That was actually considered a drawback during its original printing when Mana Burn actually existed, because if you couldn't use all the mana you got from Mana Drain, you took damage. So, even though Mana Drain is obviously strictly better than Counterspell now, would you consider Mana Drain strictly better or worse than Counterspell in a world where Mana Burn exists? Because that is a downside to lose life if you're not able to spend all the mana, even though it is an upside to get the extra mana from your Counterspell. I wasn't sure how to think about this one. Again, let me know in the comments below what you think. Is Mana Drain strictly better than Counterspell if Mana Burn exists? Okay, so we went through a bunch of examples of how cards are strictly better than other cards. We talked about some examples of how cards look like they might be better or worse than others, but end up not being strictly better or worse. Why is any of this important? Why am I making a video about this? Well, the main reason is that Magic players have their own language when they're talking about the game, and it's very important that people are on the same page when they're talking about something. The intent of this video is to clarify what the term means when people who make Magic cards are talking about, so that everybody can be on the same page. It's really tedious when two people are arguing about a point, and the point that they're arguing about is technically a different thing, and they just keep going back and forth and back and forth. No, this isn't strictly better. Here's an example where it's not, and stuff like that. It's just very tedious. So hopefully this can kind of unify people's opinions on what the term means when it's being used, even if the, English dictionary definition might say otherwise. Another reason this conversation is important, well, knowing about strictly better cards and how they function in comparison to other cards can give you some insight into how R&D works and makes Magic the Gathering cards. I think it's interesting why R&D pushes into new territory sometimes and why they might upgrade an effect that you've seen forever. I mean, think about how many times you saw Torment and Voice in a limited format before it was printed in, I think, Throne of Eldraine as Thrill of Possibility, and now we just expect to get Thrill of Possibility moving forward, which we have, right? Think about how many times we saw Altar's Reap in a limited format, and now the expectation is to get Village Rights for this sort of effect. If they were to print a format now that had Altar's Reap in it, I'd be scratching my head. I was like, didn't we get a better version of this effect, right? So R&D, not exactly pigeonholing themselves, but they can use strictly better cards as a way to kind of improve an effect that has been lackluster or make an effect more competitive with the, growing power level of the environment around it. It's also worth noting that doing too much of this can lead to power creep. In fact, making strictly better cards is part of the contributing factor for how power creep eventually happens in pretty much every card game, right? When you make a strictly better version of a card, you have artificially powered up your game, and doing this too much could be a bit of a downside. It makes it so that older cards that have been power crept on are no longer relevant. Think about Bone Splinters and Bone Shards. Bone Shards came out in Modern Horizons, and it is a strictly better version of Bone Splinters. A couple years later, you play Dominaria United and you see Bone Splinters, and in the back of your head, you're thinking, well, I've played with Bone Shards before. This is just better. Why am I playing with this worse version? It's especially funny when you have cards in the same set where one of them is strictly better than the other. And a funny example of this was Smuggler's Copter versus Sky Skiff in Kaladesh. Smuggler's Copter is better in every way, shape, and form than Sky Skiff. And of course, they use rarity to solve that issue, but it is funny to just see a card with a strictly better version of that same exact card in the same set. In fact, as an aside, I think this is kind of funny. I was playing a Decathlon Jump-In event on Magic Arena. This is where you pick two kind of pre-packaged decks, you mix them together and shuffle them up, and that's your deck. And I picked two mono red decks, and in my opening hand for my first match, I had a copy of Sure Strike from one deck and a copy of Furious Bellow from another deck, and Furious Bellow is just a strictly better version of Sure Strike. So every time I drew Sure Strike, I was like, well, I really wish this was the other card because I know there's a better version of this card, right? R&D can actually avoid the whole power creep thing by making strictly better cards by doing analogs instead. And in fact, analogs happen set in, set out. I guarantee every Magic set that comes out has like 20 to 30 analogs. And this is when you take two cards and you make them very similar to each other. You tweak one a little bit to make it close to a new card, but you don't just make it strictly better or worse. This used to be a practice that was way more common back in the day when there was block drafting, where you would draft multiple sets together. Obviously, they started off with one set, and then a couple months later, a new set would be released, and they would be drafted with the original set. And you wanted to maintain a lot of the limited format archetypes and stuff like that, but you didn't want to just make cards that were strictly better than the cards from the first pack, so you would make analogs, cards that were reminiscent of the cards from the original set. Did a very similar thing so that the draft themes could still come together, but didn't just completely obsolete the original card, right? Think about a Crow and Squire versus Wingsteed Rider in the Theros block, or this is how we end up with things like Falcon Wrath Noble versus Blood Artist. I think Falcon Wrath Noble came out in Innistrad, and then Blood Artist came out in Avacyn Restored. And maybe that's a bad example, because I'm pretty sure Avacyn Restored was drafted separately from Innistrad, but you can see how they wanted to take an effect and port it over to a new format without just overriding the card that they had originally made in the first place. All right, that's all my 2 cents about the term strictly better, why it matters, some examples of how to identify it, so on and so forth. I'm going to leave you with an example here, and this is an example that people love to use when they discuss strictly better cards. Anytime somebody says they know what strictly better means, I guarantee there's somebody on the internet who likes to come out with this example. So just humor me here, play along with this example, and then I'll leave you off for the day. So imagine your life total is 3, your opponent's life total is 5, and it's a really close game. You have a 5 power creature on board that can attack this turn, and the opponent's only blocker is Mogg Maniac. For those who don't know, if Mogg Maniac takes damage, it deals that much damage to your opponent. So if you attack with your 5 power creature, they're going to block with the Mogg Maniac, you're going to lose the game. You are Hellbent, and you draw for your turn, and you rip Lightning Bolt off the top of your library. Well, Lightning Bolt can't kill your opponent because they're at 5. You could use it to remove their blocker, but you're at 3 life, so you're going to die if you do that because the Mogg Maniac will kill you. Well, if only that Lightning Bolt had been a shock, you would probably have just won the game. People like to use examples like this all the time to disprove the whole strictly better, strictly worse than conversation, because in this example, you did in fact come up with a scenario where it would have been better to have shock than Lightning Bolt, but if you've been listening to this video, what do you think? Was Lightning Bolt strictly better than shock in this situation, or does it not apply? Let you figure it out. Let me know in the comments down below, but that's going to go ahead and do it for this conversation about strictly better. Hopefully the purpose of this video is to get at least 1 or 2 people to understand how this term is being used by the people who make Magic the Gathering so that there's less confusion when there's arguments over whether cards are strictly better or worse. If you have any examples of cards that are strictly better than others, strictly worse than others, or if you have an opinion about the Mana War Exclusion Mage or the Counterspell Mana Drain thing, let me know in the comments below. Those 2 I thought were super curious, and I didn't have the gall to make a statement on them. I wasn't 100% sure, so I'll leave it up to you all. Anyway, that's going to go ahead and do it. Thanks for being a supporter of Jank Diver Gaming. Thanks for spending your time on YouTube here listening to me rant about Magic terminology. Just real nerd stuff. I will be out of commission for a little while as I bring my newborn into this world and acclimate him with the world of Magic the Gathering. So thanks for your support as always. Love to hear from y'all. Follow us on Twitter. Find us in the Discord for Jank Diver Gaming down below. But that's going to do it. My name's Timothy Zaccanino. This has been episode 9 of Scattered Thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all next time.